And so we're going to talk this morning about what it is to be a follower. We're going to talk about a scripture in Luke where Jesus is calling some of his first followers. And this year, as I'm given the opportunity to speak by Pastor Reg, I love how much he gives me the opportunity to speak, but the tricky thing is I can't do like a series because I'm not going to give him any ideas. I'm not weeks in a row, but I can't do it. And so I was just praying and saying to God, kind of, what do you want me to speak about as we go through this year? And I just kind of felt compelled, to work through the book of Luke. And so as I speak to you this year, I'm just going to be working my way through the book of Luke, and I was kind of drawn to Luke chapter 5, verse 1 through 11. And so if you have your Bibles, we're going to be parked in Luke chapter 5, verse 1 through 11. And we're going to talk about that idea of what it is to be a follower, and specifically to be a follower of Jesus. And so, for those of you who know the story well of Jesus, this will be kind of revision history for you, but for those who don't know, Jesus had 12 disciples who followed him everywhere during his time of ministry. These were all very random people from the outside perspective. These weren't the best of the best. These weren't, he didn't go to Bible college to pick his followers. He went to very random locations. And so he had this group of 12 disciples. They were all selected by him around the beginning of his ministry. We also know from Scripture that Jesus grew up in the home, not of a pastor. He wasn't a pastor's kid. Jesus was the kid of a carpenter. And so growing up in that time, in that tradition, he would have learned his father's trait. And so for Jesus growing up, he was a carpenter. This would have been what he learned. But in this story, we're going to see Jesus interacting with fishermen. And as far as we know, this was not Jesus' area of expertise. He was not a fisherman. This wasn't what he did growing up. He was a carpenter. And so we know this wasn't his area of expertise, but he gives some directions to the disciples that led to a miraculous result. And this is what we often see in Jesus' life. And so starting in Luke. Oh, sorry, it's Luke. Did I get the wrong scripture? No, it's 1. I don't know why I said 5. 1. One day, as Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, the people were crowding around him and listening to the word of God. He saw at the water's edge 2 boats left there by the fishermen who were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to pull out a little from shore. Then he sat down and taught the people from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into deep water and let down the nets for a catch." And so already we have a whole lot of information in this first section that's very interesting. It is chapter 5. Yeah, chapter 5, verse 1. I knew it was chapter 5, but I got verse 1 mixed up. And so he's by his boat. He's by this boat. Jesus goes out into the water with them. And there are these fishermen. And he's telling them, after they've just washed their nets, and so we know they've just finished. They were out for a whole night fishing. They're washing their nets. They've caught nothing. And Jesus is saying, "Put your nets back out." And so Simon answered him to this request, "Master," in verse 5, "we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything. But because you say so, I will let down the nets." And when they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. And so they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. And when Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and he said, "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." For he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken. And so were James and John, Simon's partners. And then Jesus said to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on you will fish for people." And so they pulled their boats up on shore. They left everything, and they followed him. And so what we're reading here is Jesus calling some of his first disciples to follow him, to leave everything behind. And in reading this passage, I think we can learn a few things about what it looks like to follow Jesus, what he's calling us to. He kind of gives them hints of what's to come right here in this first interaction. And so Jesus is asking us to follow him even when what he asks appears to make no sense. Jesus is calling us to follow him even when it may seem countercultural. And so Jesus calls us to follow no matter what. And so oftentimes, Jesus is going to call us to do things in our life that just aren't going to look right. They're not going to make sense. I'm sure some of you who are lifelong Christians, you have stories of these times in your life when you feel a call in your heart to do something and it just doesn't make any sense. And you have to make this decision. Am I a follower of Jesus? Am I a real, genuine follower of Jesus? Or do I just say that I am? And you get scared and you pull back and you don't do what he's calling you to do. And so right here in this passage, we see this. Jesus, the son of a carpenter, as we said, he comes to the side of a lake and he tells these fishermen who've been out all night to take their nets that they just cleaned, put them back out in the water. Was anyone here a fisherman by trade, or does anyone here just fish casually? We know, us fishermen, I'll put myself in there. I haven't fished in a few years, but I'll call myself a fisherman. We know that the worst time to fish is just middle of the day, it's hot out. Especially there in the desert, it's hot out, you're out in the lake, there's waves everywhere, and especially at my lake, right, it was super calm in the morning, super calm at night, but during the day it's just really wavy. You're putting your anchor in, but the boat's still getting pulled around, and it's just so hot out, and the fish just aren't biting. And so that's the other thing here, is that the fishermen were done for the day because you don't fish in the middle of the day in the desert. That's just not when you would fish. And so when it made the least sense, this carpenter comes along and says, hey, you fishermen, you're doing your job wrong. Put your nets out. Maybe it wasn't quite like that. But he tells them to take a leap of faith, believe in him, and put their nets out. And because of what they'd seen Jesus doing, because they'd been listening to this man speak, they knew that he was different. And so because he was Jesus, even though it made no sense and it was countercultural, they said, okay. Even though it was a man who had no expertise in the area, they said yes. And so they take their boat out, they put the nets out, and then not only do they catch fish, but they catch so much that they have to call for help, and the nets are overflowing and they're breaking. And so we see in this story Jesus give an odd request. And even though they were the experts, they were the ones that knew better, and they'd already been out all night at the prime fishing time and didn't catch anything, they went right back to where they were and trusted Jesus, and they were rewarded. They were blessed. And we also see in this story that Jesus then says to them, follow me. Tells them to pack up everything and follow them. And even that was countercultural in and of itself. That was something that bucked the trend, because these men were not the creme de la creme. These weren't the guys that went to Bible college and got their 4.0s and were on the dean's list. These were the guys that flunked out of Bible college. In this day, if you were a Jewish child, you would all go and you would learn, and then only the best of the best would be kept around to become rabbis, the leaders of the church of the day. And so these were the men that had flunked out. They went back home, they worked for dad. Their father had this boat, he taught them how to fish growing up, and they were continuing the tradition, and this was how it was back then. But Jesus is calling these fishermen to then be more than that. And so they trusted Jesus whenever it seemed to make no sense. And so there are times that when we are a follower of Jesus, we're going to be called to do something that makes no sense. There's this pastor down in the States, his name's David Platt. Some of you may have read his book. He has a few books, but he has one called Radical. And this man, David Platt, when he wrote this book, he was a young pastor. This was quite a few years back. And he'd somehow found himself in his mid-20s and all of a sudden the lead pastor of a megachurch down in the States. And so he went from having, Bible college to worry about just getting your grades, and all of a sudden here, just a couple years later, he has a congregation of over 4,000 people, 5,000 people. He has this huge congregation, all kinds of stress that I couldn't imagine the kind of stresses that you have to go through to be a lead pastor of a church that size. And these expectations that he'll maintain the numbers. We need to keep growing, right? That's often a worry and a concern of those large churches, is we need to keep all these people happy. And I can't imagine being the guy in charge of keeping 5,000 people happy. I couldn't do it. And so we have this guy, David Platt, and he goes on this missions trip to China. And he gets there, and if you don't know, in China, Christianity is not accepted. And so they kind of have to sneak around, and the Bible, if they catch you with the Bible, that's punishable by law. And so there's all this secrecy around the Christian church in China out of necessity. And so he was there, and he saw these things happen in this church. He saw these people so desperate for God that it completely changed his life, and he felt God calling him to do something different back here in North America. And he started to feel this call to change the way his church was run. And so he was over there, and he said the moment that changed it for him was they were in this circle, and they'd gotten access to Bibles. And there was these farmers who were also the pastors there, and they'd been out on the field all day. And they'd just finished their work, and then they had to he said they took all these, tunnels and everything, and you fake people out because they thought they were getting followed, like it was straight out of a movie. But they get to this small church, and they were able to give these men Bibles for the first time. And he said there was puddles of tears at the joy that these men finally got these Bibles. And then he said he spent the week with them, and he was teaching them about the Old Testament. And it took him 4 days. He had 5 days there. It took him 4 days to teach them the Old Testament, which is an incredible feat in and of itself. And they got to the end of the 4th day, and they said, well, the book's not finished. What about this other stuff here? And so he said on day 5, he did the entire New Testament. Because these men just couldn't get enough of the Bible, the Word, and they were so excited because they don't have access to it like us. I mean, I have like 4 Bibles in my office alone. I have it in my pocket on my phone. And so we just take it for granted, the Word of God. And so he saw these things, and it changed the way that he wanted to lead his church. And so he comes back, and he feels God leading him to do something that just made no sense. And it was to have a weekly prayer meeting at church. Now, that in and of itself is pretty normal. We have a weekly prayer meeting. Most churches have a weekly prayer meeting, and it's something that's important for the church. But what he wanted to do was have a weekly prayer meeting with no plan, no structure, no chairs. And so what he did is he got the main sanctuary, and he took all the chairs out, put them away in storage. They usually had a worship team play a couple songs at their midweek prayer meeting. He got rid of that, got rid of the music. They had prayer leaders who kind of would organize and put people into teams and pray together, got rid of that. And what he had at the end was just a bunch of people sitting on the floor praying together. And there's all kinds of stuff that could have stopped him from doing this. I mean, it's a church that size. There's people saying, well, what about those who can't sit on the floor? Why not have some music to kind of get people into it? Why not have leaders? I mean, there's a group of so many people. Why not have leaders at each prayer circle so that we kind of keep things on track? But what he really felt was that he needed to go into this with no plan. And we just the only plan was pray. And so he got up on Sunday morning, and he said he got to the pulpit, and he said, I'm going to be here Thursday night. And if you want to show up, I don't know what I'm going to do, but there's going to be some prayer, so why don't you show up? And he had no idea what was going to happen. But that first week, he said over 400 people showed up, and as the year progressed, more and more people were coming out, and out of this prayer meeting, they started to change the culture of the church. And the church actually ended up growing quite a bit because people were excited about Jesus, and they were wanting to tell their neighbors and share the good news. And so I'm sure that first Sunday there was all kinds of nerves. He talks about in the book, too, that, there's the thought of, well, the board, what are they going to say? What are people going to do when the chairs are missing? I mean, that alone they're going to freak out about. And there's just all this stuff that was going through his brain. But God was telling him that he needed to do something, and it needed to be countercultural. It needed to look different. And so we listen to Jesus, and we say yes to him, even when it makes no sense. Just as the disciples here. They said yes to Jesus even when they were the experts. They were the fishermen. And so it would have made more sense for them to say, no, we already cleaned our nets. We're going out tomorrow. But because Jesus said so, Peter said, I'll do it, Lord. And then he blessed them. And so we need to be going to God. We need to be actively seeking his direction. We need to be actually spending time in the Word and praying actively and saying, God, what is it? What do you have for me? And then when he gives us that direction, and it seems like it might be a little crazy or make no sense, then we need to have the courage to say yes to that. And so say yes to him when he calls us to the countercultural. And if you're not sure if it's something from God or just a far-fetched idea that somehow ended up in your head and you don't know, that's why we do this together. Talk to a friend who you trust who's a believer. Talk to a pastor. Pray together. And go to God. Ask him to give you direction. Ask him to give you things to do, and when they're countercultural, say yes. So secondly, followers of Jesus, we serve him even when we don't feel good enough. Peter, at the end of this passage, he falls to his knees and he says to Jesus, "Go away from me, because I'm a sinful man." But then Jesus instead tells him to follow me. And so Peter, along with the other disciples, as I referenced earlier, they would have spent time learning from the Torah, learning the scriptures, being trained up to be these potential religious leaders. But then they were told at a certain point, well, you're not good enough. This isn't your future. Your future is back home with your family. Either that or they would have decided on their own and felt like they just weren't ready. And so growing up, they hit this point where they realized that their future was just fishing. And that's for them, I'm sure, for the foreseeable future. They were fishers. They were fishermen. And so that was their future. And so for Peter to have Jesus tell him differently, this would have been a miracle in and of itself that he believed him and then followed him. He took that step because when he'd been told otherwise, he still believed Jesus when he said, "It doesn't matter. Come, follow me." And so Peter, he didn't believe in himself. He didn't think he was worthy. He didn't consider himself a man of God. He just said, I have too much sin. I have too much sin to even be in your presence, let alone follow you. And as you know, with Peter, even though he does say yes and he goes along with Jesus, if you know Peter's story, it wasn't the last time he sinned. And we know that Peter, at different times throughout the New Testament, fails. But he knows that in spite of his failures, Jesus is still calling him to follow. And he says yes every time. And we know that eventually Peter would go on to do some amazing things in spite of his failures. If you look in Acts at the beginning of the church, we see that Peter and Paul and the rest of the early believers, the church just expands like crazy. And Peter gets up and preaches on that first day, and we see thousands of people come to know Christ. And if Peter on that first day had just decided, I don't believe you, God. I don't believe you. I'm not good enough. Get away, and just ignored him and walked away, he never would have been able to see so many people come to know Jesus because of that. And so even though Peter didn't feel like he was good enough, Jesus chose him anyway. And I think we as believers, and we just use that excuse quite a bit to get out of doing things, don't we? We often feel like there's something I should be doing, there's more I could do, but first I need to take care of myself. I'm not reading my Bible enough, so I can't lead this yet. Or I'm not praying enough, so I can't do this. I would help out at Awana, but I don't know. I'm in a weird place spiritually, so I don't know if I should do that. Or I want to help out as an usher, but I don't know if I'm the right person to be shaking hands with people at the front because I'm not a good enough representation of Jesus. And we find these excuses, and we often will just say, I'm just not a good enough Christian. Once I get my life together, but not yet. And I find even in my life, I've only been around 30 years, but even in my life, that's a good excuse to get you through quite a few years of not doing anything. I get asked to volunteer for stuff, and it's easy to just go, oh, you wouldn't want me. I'm not a good, I've got a few things I need to iron out. And you may even think it's something you might enjoy, but the more you learn about the task and the role, you realize it just might inconvenience your night. It might inconvenience your life. You might have to move around your schedule a bit. And so all of a sudden you start to hear this voice in your head that just starts to tell you, well, you're not good enough anyway. Let someone else do it. We kind of get that mindset of, I don't know if I should be doing that. We'll let someone else do it. And the problem with that, especially here in our church, is who else? Who else is going to do it if not you? A church this size, we don't have an excess of volunteers. If we look at our church and who's volunteering in our midweek and our Sunday morning, a small percentage of people are doing a high percentage of things. And so it's easy to have that excuse of I'm not good enough, but the difficult thing is saying yes in spite of that. The first time I traveled in the summer with the Kingswood ministry team, I worked really hard to get on that team in advance. In school, I spent a lot of time at the beginning of school, I spent a lot of time not in class, which led to some time not in school because I didn't have the grades to be in school. And so kind of my road to recovery, my redemption tour, as it were, it was a hard and long road, but eventually it led to me being able to represent the school in the summer. And so I thought that this summer, as a kid, I grew up at camp, and so I kind of idolized these ministry teams, and I thought that's got to be the best thing ever. That's probably the greatest summer you could ever have, and they're just such good Christians. And I even, as a kid, I thought to myself, I could never do that. I'm not a good enough Christian. I even had that excuse. But I finally got to this point where I was ready to be on a summer team. I got in on the team, and we were a band, and there was 5 of us. We were all friends at the start of the summer. And that's a key word, at the start of the summer. We were all friends. And something happened that summer where all of a sudden you're around people 24/7 and personalities just clash. And you realize that you're a once-a-week friend. And I love you once a week. But I don't love you right now. But it got to the point where our group was just fractured. We were broken. And we were going to these camps, and there was times where I felt like a fraud. I had this journal that I was going to write about my summer experiences, so years later I could go back and look at the journal. And I found the journal this week, and it ends at day 3. And that's it. And then there's a little blurb at the end about how, well, the summer's done, and I feel a lot farther from God now than I did at the start of the summer. And I'm not sure if some of these guys are going to be my friends anymore. And I did find some people that are better friends than I've ever been before, but it's been a weird summer, and I thought it was going to be nothing but amazing. And there was a lot of amazing, but there's a lot of weird times. And I personally, I don't know, I can't speak for the rest of the guys, but there was different weeks where I started to feel like a fraud, like I wasn't good enough to be doing that. But I was in this situation where it's either you do it or you go home and you ruin a bunch of people's summers. There was all kinds of responsibilities we had. I couldn't just bail. I had to do it. And so even though I felt very weird about my faith, and I was always sure in my faith, but I just felt like I wasn't a good enough Christian right now, and I had these weird relationships, and there was this tension in the group. Every night when we got up to play music, or every time a teen would come up and want to talk to me about Jesus, I had to ignore that voice of, you're not ready for this right now, you're not good enough. And I just had to push through and know that Jesus picked me to be on this team for a reason. I'm here for a purpose. And in spite of all my mess, it doesn't mean I can't help other kids. And so that summer, in spite of all the voices in my head telling me, you're not good enough, we were able to see tons and tons of kids come to know Christ. We were able to see people overcome addictions, people overcome all kinds of pain in their lives. And we were just able to see these amazing things happen in spite of us feeling like we fell short. And so just like the disciples, they felt like they felt short. Peter felt like he felt short, and he would fall short many times. But in spite of that, Jesus was calling him to follow him, and so he said yes. He didn't let the excuse of I'm not good enough get in the way. And I think for us as a church, we need to take that on going forward of getting rid of the excuse of I'm not good enough. We've all sinned. We've all fallen short of the glory of God. But in spite of that, Jesus calls us to follow him anyway. And he chooses each and every one of us in spite of that. And so even when we don't feel good enough, and this is for me too, just as much as it is for you, just say yes to Jesus' requests. And just like every other part of following Jesus, get accountability for things that are making you not feel good enough. We need accountability to follow Jesus. And so lastly, a follower of Jesus, pretty simply, shares the good news with non-believers. At the end of the passage, we read that he says to the disciples, you may know how to fish for food, but I'm going to teach you how to be fishers of men. Now, if you're not around the church, that's a really weird sentence. Fishers of men, but we know that that means reaching those who don't believe in Jesus and showing them the truth. And so we know that this is exactly what the disciples ended up doing at the end of their time with Jesus. After Jesus had ascended into heaven to be with God, the disciples just began fishing for men. They told people about Jesus. The church began to multiply like crazy. People were becoming Christ followers. They were learning of this life-giving news. These people would dedicate the rest of their lives to being fishers of men and sharing the life-giving news of Jesus. The disciples, we know many were martyred. And in spite of that, till their dying breath, they shared the good news of Jesus. And so this is what Pastor Reg was talking about for our church with one of our core values, relational. As a church, we're wanting to be more intentional about sharing the good news of Jesus. Not that we aren't doing it now, but we could be doing it better. And so we want to be more intentional about sharing Jesus with non-believers. And we've been challenging the church to do the same as we're challenging ourselves. And I think most of you have heard this before, but it's true that one of the best examples right now of what we are already doing as a church is our midweek programming with Awana and with youth. And we're seeing these kids and these teens, they're coming into the church, and they're hearing about Jesus for the first time because most of them aren't from homes where they would attend church on Sunday. And so we have all kinds of connections to these kids in the community, and we're sharing with them about Jesus when they may not have heard about him otherwise. And in youth, we've been lucky enough to have a group come along, and we have this group of teens that because of what we're doing in Awana, each year it's more and more of our group is a higher percentage of Awana children who've graduated to youth. But we have this group of kids where over the past couple of years we've been able to go through a few youth rallies, and they've heard about Jesus, and I've been sharing with them about Jesus. And we've had around 8 of them decide they want to follow Jesus and accept Jesus. And for most of them, if not all of them, this was their first time ever making this decision. And that's because of our church, what we're doing here. And it's good, but we can do more. I'm happy with 8, but I've got more than 8 kids who come to youth group. And I know that some of them haven't made that decision yet. And I know how important this decision was for me. It's a life-changing, life-giving decision. And so as a church, we're trying to find ways to be relational. We're trying to find ways to be more relational, not only as a church, but as individuals, and share the good news. And so we as a church need to be better at sharing the good news as we're living our lives. All the people who I've had the honor of leading to Christ in my life, for the most part, it wasn't the first day or the first time I met them. We built a relationship. We talked. I got to know them. I got to know what was going on in their life, why they might be holding back. And as we built a relationship, eventually it led us to that point of a decision. And so I had to build those relationships and build that trust in order to help them come to the realization that they need Jesus in their life just as much as I need Jesus. And so are we doing a good enough job at building those relationships? Are you doing a good enough job at building those relationships in your life? Are all of the people in your life right now Christians? Because if they are, you need new friends. You need to meet some new people. It's important, as I said, we got to do this together. We need Christian brothers and sisters. We need to support one another. But we got to have non-Christians in our life. Because we need to be sharing with them this good news that changed our life. And so if you don't have any non-Christians in your life right now, I'm challenging you to make some new friends, no matter your age. Never too late to make a friend. And so we need to be relational and be intentional about finding ways to share Jesus with others. And so from this story, this is what we learn about being a follower. We learn that we're going to be called to do some things that make no sense, but no matter what, we follow Jesus. And we know that followers of Jesus serve even when they don't feel good enough. And a follower of Jesus shares the good news with non-believers. It's one of my favorite things about being around a person who's just become a Christian is they haven't learned the rules about being embarrassed about your faith or keeping quiet in crowds. You go in a crowd with a new believer and they'll tell everybody. And I just love it because I wish I had that courage. But it's because they're so excited and they understand just how much their life has changed. And so I pray to God and I ask him for that excitement. And I want that courage to be that person, be that light to the world.